Yeah, welcome back to the next panel on truth commissions now. I'm very glad to see you all again, or new faces now again, and I'm very happy to welcome, apart from Elin, new speakers and panelists here, and very happy to welcome Elin back on stage now. And I would like to start off with a quote by the Canadian professor on gender equality and social justice, Rosemary Nagy, who said in relation to transitional justice in cases of basically colonialism or settler colonialism, that, I quote, "It is rather awkward to affix the label transitional to justice long denied." And I feel one of the ways to get the closest to this justice we can get to is by putting up truth commissions on Indigenous or crimes committed against Indigenous peoples. And in this panel now, we want to highlight this issue with a couple of case studies. So we will have a look at the Guatemalan case, we will have a look at the Canadian case, and we will have a look at the Norwegian case. And it is my pleasure now to introduce you to the panelists of this panel. First, we have Elin Skaar, again, being part of the panel, who is a research professor at the Christian Michelsen Institute, having worked on human rights and transitional justice for over 3 decades now. She is the head of CMI's research on transitional justice, and her research focus on countries that, through processes of democratization, deal with human rights violations, transitional justice, strengthening and reforming the courts, and development issues more generally, is especially highlighted by her being part of the core team investigating the work of the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as being head of a project on truth commissions and conflict-related sexual violence. Next, I want to introduce you to Rachel Sieder, who is Senior Research Professor at the Center for Research and Graduate Studies in Social Anthropology in Mexico City. She's an Associate Senior Researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute and Associate Fellow at the Institute for the Study of the Americas at the University of London. She has a master's degree in Latin American Studies and a PhD in politics from the University of London. Her expertise on a broad range of topics such as human rights, Indigenous rights and movements, Indigenous law, legal anthropology, the state and violence is showcased through the multitude of her publications and memberships on editorial boards. Then I would like to introduce you to Aaron Spitzer, who is an associate teaching professor at the University in Bergen's Department of Comparative Politics, where he focuses on Indigenous governance. Before coming to Norway, he spent nearly 20 years as a journalist covering Indigenous political developments in the Inuit and Dene regions of Arctic Canada and Alaska. And last but not least, I would like to introduce you to Elin Monstad, who is a PhD candidate at the Department of Comparative Politics here at the University in Bergen, where she has written her PhD thesis as part of the project Indigenous People and Governance in the Arctic. She has a background in political science, holding a bachelor's degree and master's degree in comparative politics, as well as a bachelor's degree in English. Previous to her PhD, she had several short-time employments as a scientific assistant, worked for the Norwegian United Nations Association, and for the Norwegian Center for Research Data. We will start off with a brief introduction by Elin Skaar on the topic of Indigenous Truth Commissions in general, and afterwards our panelists will introduce you to the case studies they're working on. So Rachel will present the not so in the strict sense Indigenous Truth Commission in Guatemala. Afterwards, Aaron will talk about the Truth Commission in the case of Canada. And finally, Elin Monstad will talk about the case in Norway. Please, Elin, start.
How old I am. Can I have the microphone? It might be, yeah. I'm saying thank you for rubbing in how old I am. When you worked for 3 decades on transitional justice, you know that you're getting close to retirement. No, but on a serious note, thank you, Dorothee. I'd like to give, maybe just give a brief overview of truth commissions in the world in general. Now, how many people in this room know something about truth commissions or have it as a field of speciality? Quite a few. Are there any people who don't know what a truth commission is? No, you all know what it is. Okay, that's good. But let me just start off by saying then that there are somewhere between 40 and 70 truth commissions in the world, depending on what kind of definitions we employ. And if we employ the definition that Dorothee gave in the previous panel, and add one caveat, which is that it has to publish a final report and give recommendations, there are about 40 plus. If we expand the universe to also including commissions that start their work but don't finish their work, or issue a report but don't make it public, or commissions that are not state-sponsored, that means set down by either the executive or parliament, but also include truth commissions that are set up or sponsored by NGOs, we can push the number up to about 70. Which means that it's a substantial number of truth commissions, and the number is steadily increasing. I think the last one in Latin America to publish a report, which happened literally, I think 2 weeks ago, was the Colombian Truth Commission. And as far as I know, there is also initiative going on in Bolivia, which is ongoing. There are several in Africa that are ongoing. So this is like a growing universe. Now, the focus for this panel is Indigenous rights, and it says Indigenous commissions in the title, but I'd like to just expand a little bit on that and say that Indigenous people have very often been the victims of human rights violations, and they haven't had their own commissions. Sometimes Indigenous people are, we very often assume that Indigenous people are a minority, but in some contexts, as Rachel will talk to later today, Indigenous people can also be a majority in countries. Truth commissions for very many years either explicitly did not address violations committed against Indigenous people specifically. For example, in the Chilean case, the Truth Commission in Chile was tasked with, the first Truth Commission was tasked with explicitly focusing on extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances. Similarly, the Truth Commission in Argentina focused specifically on forced disappearances, which means that there wasn't an eye on violations of Indigenous rights, although violations happened against Indigenous people. So to what extent then the reports actually focused on Indigenous people was more or less accidental. If they happened to be victims, they might be included, but they were not explicitly targeted as such. Let's put it targeted or investigated by the Truth Commission. However, there are some Truth Commissions, especially in Latin America, where Indigenous people make up a substantial portion of the population, where the Truth Commission realized that a lot of the violations were committed against Indigenous people. In some of these reports, recommendations have been made to address violations of Indigenous rights, but they're very few. But what we have seen in later years, which is the focus of this panel, are commissions that have been set down specifically to investigate violations against Indigenous peoples. And this is like, I don't know if I should start this debate, but this is like, to me, this is like a new body or type of commissions, because originally Truth Commissions were normally set down in contexts of democratic transition, which means after the end of authoritarian regimes of various kinds, whether apartheid regimes in South Africa, military authoritarian regimes in Latin America, or one-party states in some contexts. So the context was a transition from an authoritarian to a more democratic regime, or from a context of internal armed conflict to something which was more peaceful, like in the cases of Guatemala and El Salvador and Peru and many more. What we see now is that we see truth commissions in well-established Western democracies. So this is a new context. There is no authoritarianism, there is no official state repression, there is no transition, there is no, there is no regime change. Nevertheless, there is an increased recognition in many so-called settler colonies, and I don't know whether Norway fits in there or not, we can discuss that later, but in countries where people have come from one country or one part of the world, usually Europe, settled in another part, typically where there are populations already. These populations have partly been wiped out, have partly died from disease, some have survived, and where people have survived, they have been subjugated to state repression in the past, okay? So now there has been an increasing realization in some of these countries that we have to do something about this structural repression of indigenous people, which has happened in an era of democracy. Now, there are very few such countries which are sort of taking, in Norwegian we would say oppgjør med fortiden, means like addressing your past in a systematic way. We have a Truth Commission in Norway, which Elin will talk about, which was established in 2018. And as far as I know, this was the 4th or the 5th commission in the world actually addressing indigenous populations violations specifically, which we then call Indigenous Truth Commissions, right? So we've had one in Australia looking into repression of the Aborigines. There has been a commission in Greenland, which was not endorsed by the Danish state, the former colonial power, and it hasn't gained much traction. I haven't read the report. Then we have the report that came out in Australia was on the stolen generations, which basically means that children were taken from their families and placed in other homes, and they lost touch with their families and contact with their ethnicity, their religion, their practices, and their traditional way of life. Canada has, which we will hear more of, has also focused on children taken away from their parents and been brought up in residential schools. And Norway has a much broader focus. But typically, what is common for these commissions is that they look at either broad repression, structural repression against indigenous people, or they look at specific types of harms committed towards indigenous people. There are 2 more that have been established after the Norwegian Truth Commission, which is, there's one in Finland and one in Sweden. They were established, one in October, one in November last year, so they're very, very recent. And what is common for these 3 commissions in the Nordic countries is that they're looking at violations against the Sami people, which is an indigenous population which is cross-border. The Sami live in Norway, in Finland, in Sweden, and a few live in Russia. So interestingly enough, we're seeing commissions in 3 countries addressing violations against the Sami people, but the Norwegian Commission has a broader mandate, not only looking at violation against this indigenous group in Norway, but also broaden it to include 3 more minority groups, which I think Elin is going to talk more about. So this was just to contextualize a little bit of this panel and where we're coming from and some of the questions that we want to address. It's like, my big question is, why now? You know, this repression has been going on for 100 or 200 or 300 years. So why are we seeing these commissions now? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction, Elin. And maybe we get some answers on the question you just raised in the presentations now. Maybe we can talk about it later in the panel. But now I want to give the word to Rachel and present the case on Guatemala.
Thank you, Dorothee. And very pleased to be on the panel. What I would like to do is just, I have been working on this issue one way or another just about as long as Elin, so you're not the oldest person in the room on this. And so I would like to just reflect on some of the questions raised on the basis of a Latin American experience more broadly before I talk about Guatemala specifically. And I think I'm going to pose more questions than I'm going to answer with this. But I mean, the central question is an obvious one. It's the elephant in the room, right? What, if any, kind of reckoning with colonial violences do truth commissions try to do? Can they reckon with colonial violence? When we think about the scale and the dimensions of the kinds of harm that we're talking about, of epistemic violence, of erasure, territorial dispossession, of labor dispossession and slavery, of systematic settler violence, white supremacy, I could keep going. So I think we need to kind of reflect on the nature and effects of truth commission-driven forms of reckoning, and specifically their role in changing historical narratives. This was something that the previous panel was also, there were questions about, but also the discussion around reparations and redress. So the Latin American experience as such, they were kind of the precursors or the front runners in this global Truth Commission transitional justice explosion. And I guess you had a kind of shift from the earlier 1980s commissions of a sort of package of truth plus amnesty plus reconciliation, and I put that in inverted commas in some shape or form, that guided the truth commissions towards what we have now, which is truth plus some justice mechanisms plus reparations, plus a range of mechanisms to ensure no repetition. Right? And you have the experience, as Elin, and it was referenced in the previous panel, referred to, of these Truth Commission experiences of the 1980s through to today. So from having no intersectional decolonial perspectives on human rights violations in the early period, to the ethnic chapter of the Colombian Truth Commission, which was published last month, which specifically focuses on the disproportionate violence and harm to Indigenous, Afro-descendant and other minority peoples and their territories that occurred during Colombia's decades of internal armed conflict. Just the title is very telling. It's I'll say it in Spanish and English: El continuum de violencias contra los pueblos étnicos, el trato colonial y el racismo estructural. The continuum of violences against ethnic peoples, that's the label for the groups in Colombia, colonial treatment and structural racism. So I think there's a recognition very much that about the critical junctures and the way that truth commissions can play a key role in future processes, in politics and in future imaginaries and in ways of understanding the past, the present. Even with the recognition that we all have that truth commissions are always going to fall short of what we might like them to do. Can truth commissions explain why certain forms of systematic violence disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant peoples in Latin America, and also certain sectors within those populations, right? We've talked about women, children, but also LGBTIQ population. In the Colombian report, that is a section within that report that I referenced, and with what specific effects. So, and kind of what forms of accountability are the most hopeful paths, right? This is a question that we've all been asking, right? Where should the locus of accountability and reckoning be? Is it possible to think about the decolonization of truth commission processes, right? They are a global technology as well. And then there's the questions of accountabilities and remedies that we've touched on, right? Do truth commissions leave open or close the possibility of subsequent criminal trials? Do they generate information that could be used in subsequent processes? Can processes in domestic or international law, which are fields of colonial power, as we know, ever reckon with colonial dispossession and harm? And then what about forms of reckoning in Indigenous law itself, right? Contexts of legal pluralism and recognition of the self-determination of indigenous peoples. Right? So none of us, I think, who've been involved in these processes would ever refute the symbolic and the political importance of the forms of reckoning and the attempts to reset historical narratives that truth commissions can offer. And trials too can have and have played, I'll say more about that for Guatemala, I think vital roles in these processes of fighting against the systematic colonial erasure of indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples. Then there are all kinds of questions, which are the sorts of things that the transitologas and Elin particularly has kind of focused us to ask detailed questions on the empirical dimensions of these things, right? What's their mandate, right? What time frame? How do they conceive of harm? What kind of violations are they addressing? What's their analytical perspective on human rights violations? Are they looking at collective, individual? What's their analytical perspective? Territorio como víctima in Colombia, territory as a direct victim of the armed conflict in Colombia. And what's the relationship between civil society organizations and the truth commissions, all the kind of complicated questions that we referenced in the previous panel about voice, about silence, about who listens to whom, who has authority to listen, how to not re-victimize, who speaks for whom and what. And I'm not going to get into those debates, but they're obviously central. Okay. And then what kind of reparations can they conceive of and can they mandate? Right? All the debates about genocide, ecocide, yeah. I think for me, at least in the work I do, reparations that strengthen indigenous people's rights to self-determination are the key, right, to understanding that. And I'm sure that everyone else on the panel will say that. Okay, I just want to say something quickly about Guatemala then. It was one of the earlier truth commissions, 1999. It was a UN truth commission, but it was kind of hybrid of a UN and domestic truth commission, into the 36-year armed conflict or counterinsurgent Cold War in Guatemala. It wasn't a truth commission into violations against indigenous peoples, but Guatemala is roughly 50, depends on whose statistics you take, but at 40–50% indigenous Mayan, Garifuna and Xinca population. So what happened during the armed conflict? 50 of a population that was 12 million at the time of 1980, the kind of the worst years of the armed conflict. 50,000 people were disappeared, 200,000 people were killed, and 1 million people were displaced internally or went into exile. There was mass sexual violence against indigenous women and men and non-indigenous members of the opposition. 93% of the victims that were documented by the Truth Commission were indigenous. So disproportionate harm. And the same story is we see for other places in Latin America. Camila was talking about Peru. The Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission documented 70,000 victims of the internal armed conflict. Everyone thought it was going to be about 25,000. And then when the Truth Commission published, it was 70,000. Roughly 30% of Peru's population is indigenous, and 75% of the killings documented by the Truth Commission in Peru had Quechua as their first spoken language. So the multiple forms of structural racism and colonial erasure that we were hearing about in both the keynotes, the keynote today and Sylvia's yesterday, they are amplified during these internal armed conflicts. And that includes the complex processes of appropriation, territorial appropriation and exploitation through legal and illegal economies targeted at indigenous and Afro-descendant territories. So the racialized violence of the armed conflict in Guatemala was a continuation of colonial patterns of racialized and gendered dispossession and multiple forms of violence: physical violence, epistemic violence, violence against bodies, against histories, against territories, against forms of knowledge. There is such a difficulty even in translating these things. The region that I first started off working in Guatemala, which was one of the most affected by the armed conflict, people would talk to me about l'irailal, the great suffering, right? And which was, kind of impossible to translate, even as I'm saying great suffering. It doesn't do justice. Or mushuk, which is the term that Maya Kekchi women used in the trial that I will talk about to reference rape, but actually it means defilement or desacralization of every living thing, because every living thing has what we might reference as a soul or a spirit. So huge problems or challenges, not problems, challenges in translation. The Truth Commission, as was said, in Guatemala didn't mandate trials, but it didn't rule out the possibility of future trials because of the time it happened. It couldn't mandate amnesty for crimes against humanity because it's against international criminal law. And there were subsequent domestic trials, as some of you will know. There was a trial against the former dictator Rios Montt for genocide in 2013. And there was a case in 2017, the Sepur Sarko case, on racialized sexual violence and sexual slavery of Maya Kekchi women in the context of the internal armed conflict. And there are other trials, even in the context that we heard about yesterday from Erika Aifan, of almost total capture of the courts in Guatemala. There are still people and brave judges also, and fiscales, public prosecutors and lawyers taking these cases. I want to just flag up here the importance of Indigenous lawyers representing the victims, and particularly of women Indigenous lawyers in many of these cases. Also, the importance of special anthropological witness reports that explore cultural conceptions of and impacts of harm. Again, the role of Indigenous women anthropologists in Guatemala has been fundamental in this. And I also want to flag the judges in the domestic courts, the same court that the Juzgado de Mayor Riesgo, this high-risk court that Erika Aifan, who we heard yesterday, was a judge on. Well, it was criminal court like that, a first instance court that heard the genocide case in 2013. And even though the genocide verdict was subsequently overturned, the fact that this public trial took place in Guatemala was of huge consequence, and whatever happens, whatever they overrule, the consequence in terms of the public record is enormous. So just to conclude then, Latin American Truth Commissions today, violence against territories, territory as victim for Colombia, recognition of harm, and the requirement of reparations for the non-human, plus Truth Commission design, as I'm looking at Tatiana because there's so much to say about Colombia, that we could, Truth Commission designs, institutional designs that attempt to change the balance of power, right, in the doing of these things, and discussions around kind of what law is and what it can do and how you can attempt to decolonize, or at least have a commitment to decolonizing these exercises. And I think so more important than this issue of kind of whether it leads to trials or doesn't lead to trials, and obviously that's hugely contextual, right? There's no kind of one size fits all answer to this, but is the extent to which Truth Commissions set out the historical record and can reset the potentials for resetting the historical narrative, right? Opening the possibilities for future accountability. Thank you.
I really don't want to cut you off. I'm so sorry, but no. I could listen to this for hours, but we have two more cases we want to talk about. Yes, no, it was super interesting. Thank you so much for these insights. So I would like to give the word straight to Aaron and for your presentation on the Canadian case. Then thank you so much.
Thank you, Dorothee, and thank you, Rachel, and my other panel members. So as Elin kindly introduced me, before coming to Norway, I came from, or was in Canada for an extensive period of time. Elin is correct that Canada has had only one sort of commission that was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it is a country that has had I would say a long and mixed history of public commissions of inquiry into sort of the fraught relationship between the Canadian state and the Indigenous population there. Maybe the first prominent one came in the wake of the violence of the Oka crisis back in the 1990s. It was the Canadian, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. It ended up producing in the mid-90s 4,000 pages of reports, more than 400 recommendations to the Canadian government. And today it's sort of, that report is maybe most famous for the degree to which it was almost completely ignored by lawmakers after all of that work that went into it. And then most recently in Canada was the commission into, or the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which came to a conclusion in 2019 with the controversial finding that the Canadian state had committed genocide against its Indigenous population, and especially against Indigenous women who suffer from wildly disproportionate rates in Canada of violence and sexual violence, sex trafficking, incarceration, drug and narcotics addiction, and things like that. In between those two commissions came the most famous and maybe arguably most successful Indigenous Commission of Inquiry in Canada, and that was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that is also arguably the one that maybe is most relevant to the present Norwegian situation, because despite the sort of the breadth of that name, Truth and Reconciliation, that particular commission in Canada focused on one particular dimension of the Canadian relationship with Indigenous people, and that was the residential school experience, and that is related to, or arguably is related to, a process that was taking place in Norway at the same time, which was the fornorsking, or the Norwegianization of the Sami people through a similar process. So just a quick background on the Canadian residential school experience. It was instituted almost immediately after Canada became an independent state. So in the 1870s, it was a policy whereby the Indigenous population of Canada, Indigenous children, were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to often remote church-run boarding schools, which were called residential schools. The school system, the residential school system, was funded by the Canadian state. It was mostly run by the churches, particularly the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. In the course of the century that the residential school system was in place, something like 150,000 Indigenous children were sent to these schools. And as you probably already know, some proportion of those never returned home afterwards. So the Canadian residential school system, certainly in its own time and definitely afterwards, kind of became notorious for at least, I would say, 3 distinct reasons. Well, maybe 4 reasons. The first, obviously, being just sort of forcibly kidnapping children and separating them from their parents. It was notorious, of course, because it was the overt goal of it, explicitly stated by authorities, was cultural assimilation. So the point of it was to separate, I mean, the reason that these were residential schools rather than in part on reserve or near indigenous communities was the point was to physically and spiritually, psychologically, et cetera, separate children from their culture, language, et cetera, their traditional life ways, right? And of course, the children who attended these schools internalized the negative attitude that the schools had about them, which led to high levels, of course, of self-loathing, in addition, of course, to all of those cultural losses that I just mentioned. The famous goal of the residential schools, as stated by one of the heads of the residential school program, was to kill, quote, kill the Indian to save the child inside, right? Somewhat, maybe almost working countervailingly to that objective was the fact that throughout their history, the residential schools were extremely poorly funded. They were under and poorly staffed. The buildings were in poor condition. The food was in short supply. They were cold, etc. For this reason, it was a policy in the residential schools for a long period of time that the children would spend half of their time working for the institutions, cooking, cleaning, farming, etc. This was justified in Canadian government policy as being vocational education. It was, of course, more akin to forced child labor in order to support this residential school system, to make it self-funding, as it were. And then the third reason is that many of these schools became endemic sites of child abuse, and especially child sexual abuse, right? They attracted and bred often pedophilia. So the consequence of this was that almost every Indigenous community in Canada today is saddled with the aftermath of the residential school tragedy, right? There's huge amounts of individuals or even descendants of individuals who are survivors of residential schools who suffer from the unsurprising consequences of this: post-traumatic stress disorder, high levels of lateral violence, addictions, etc. The harms of the residential schools started to come out, well, let's say they started to come out to the general Canadian public in the 80s and around 1990 or so. It led to Canada's largest class action lawsuit, which was settled in 2007. In the end, there's still payouts that are ongoing, but approximately 5 billion Canadian dollars have been paid to survivors of the residential schools. One of the other key outcomes of this lawsuit was a requirement that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission be impaneled, right? So the genesis of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that it was legally mandated as an outcome of this class action lawsuit. A year after that ruling, the commission was created. It operated between 2008 and 2015, was funded by approximately 70-some million Canadian dollars. It traveled all across Canada, held 7 quite prominent national events, and any number of sort of regional and local public hearings, hearing from thousands of survivors of the residential schools. It was a victim-oriented truth and reconciliation process. They were legally prohibited from naming names. They had no power to subpoena. They could subpoena documents, but they couldn't subpoena individuals, for example. So it was victim rather than perpetrator oriented. It came to an end it wrapped up in 2015 with the release of findings, the key element of which I guess you could say are 94 calls to action. A few of which, I think 13 at last count, are considered to have been fully implemented. So an example of that is changing the oath of citizenship in Canada. So new Canadians now have to vow allegiance not just to the Queen and not just to the laws of Canada, but to obey the treaties that bind the Canadian state with the Indigenous population there. And then there are a certain number of these calls to action that have not been implemented fully. One of them that you might be aware of is the effort to more precisely document the number of deaths that took place at the residential schools and where the bodies of those children are. And that is in part what has led to the series of revelations in the past year or so regarding the rediscovery, I guess you could say, of unmarked graves at a number of these former residential schools. And then there are a number of arguably the most difficult to implement of the calls to action which have not been implemented, such as reducing the wildly disproportionate number of Indigenous Canadians who are in the criminal justice system and things like that. So there's a long, I wouldn't say long running, there's a vigorous debate in Canada as to whether we should consider the Truth and Reconciliation Commission a success, which we probably will talk about later. But one thing that can be said is that I think it's fair to say that it did form one of the key inspirations to the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I guess we're going to talk about next. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aaron, for these insights. And you gave the key point there. Elin, if you might continue now. And just that you already know, we will skip questions from my side afterwards due to the time. So when Elin comes to an end, then I encourage all of you with your own questions, please.
So thank you. And a wonderful segue into the Norwegian TRC, which is ongoing at the moment, is set to be finished originally now, basically, but has been delayed for a year due to COVID. And it's very exciting to see how they will end up. We're expecting, of course, a report with a certain amount of recommendations as to how to proceed. It's all very exciting. No big news has been released by the Commission on this topic yet. So everything, of course, is pure speculation based on previous commissions in other places. But as Elin said, this is one of the earlier Indigenous themed TRCs. It's called the Commission to Investigate the Norwegianization Policy and Injustice Against the Sami and the Kven Norwegian Finnish Peoples, which is a very broad mandate. The Norwegianization was a policy it's a bit difficult to define when it started and when it stopped, but the Commission is investigating the time from approximately 1800 and up until more or less now. And the stopping point is a bit contested, maybe in the 1950s, maybe in the 80s, maybe now, still ongoing. It's a bit difficult to say, more or less, but officially, large changes happened from the 50s onward. They have, as it is, three main points that they're working on in the mandate, which is to find and gather a historical survey of what was actually done by the Norwegian authorities towards the Samis and the other minorities mentioned, to investigate the effects on the people who experienced these things, as Aaron has already said and has been mentioned on numerous occasions. I mean, the consequences, of course, have been many and strong, and also, as is classically the case, to suggest measures for reconciliation in the hope of creating a better future with a better collaboration between all the groups. And one of the interesting things, I think, with this particular genre of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions is that it is not, as Elin said, a transition of government or political regime. It's basically the state investigating a past version of itself, with the goal of creating a transition, more or less, of a paradigm of a social framing of the understanding of the past. Because if you look at this generously, you could say that the goal of the Norwegianification process was to elevate the indigenous population to the level of the other Norwegians, Of course, the way in which they did this was very unfortunate, you might say, and the results as well have not been positive. But the understanding of the time was the way it was, and one of the things that's required for an improved future in this matter is that this understanding of the historical framework is changed, so that the Norwegian population can also adjust itself and understand its own role as the perpetrator in this case, because it tends to be seen as more of a, it's often the case with Sami politics and Sami histories that the majority Norwegian population see it as more of an internal affair for them, living up in the north, far away from here, not so very relevant in the everyday life of the majority population. And this is one of the things I believe needs to change in order for this to be a success. This invisibilization, you might say, of the history of the Samis and the Kvens and Norwegian Finns. One of the problems in that matter, you might say, is that while the history of the Norwegianification is well, the invisibilization, as I said, was a very large part of that. One potential problem is that this might be argued to be still continuing. The Norwegian TRC is fairly invisible in the general public eye. There hasn't been much information that's come from them about their findings, their recommendations, etc. So it is very interesting to see what they will do about this in order to counter this invisibility of the population. And there's the ever-present risk that this TRC ends up being yet another internal affair, you might say, for the Sami and the Norwegian Finn and the Kvenish population yet again. Hopefully, we can experience what they arguably did in Canada, which was the release of the report and a large, vigorous debate afterwards, leading many of the majority population to see their history in a new light, and then eventually a change in the institutional form and framing of, for instance, education system, etc., political systems that can reflect better this our understanding of our own history.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elin, for also introducing all us to the Norwegian case now. And thank you, three, for these very different and still similar cases in some ways. As I already said, I want to skip my own questions due to time reasons and open up to the audience. So please, as always, line up and ask the questions then.
Yes, hi. This is really, really interesting. And well, I know the Guatemalan case, but mostly to focus on the Canadian and the Norwegian case. With my Indigenous fellows in Canada and Sami land, we've talked about the potential of these truth commissions, of course, but also situating them in the context of broad Indigenous struggles. And I'm thinking about the Canadian case, this very important case on the board schools, but they're also in a broad context of fight against oil extraction in the territories. And the same thing with the Norwegian case in the context of green colonialism. And as I have been talking to them, it's very difficult and very challenging, because more and more there's a discourse of fatigue, because we need to be in the Truth Commission, but we also need to be in the struggles against extractivism. And so how do you situate these Truth Commissions within the broader Indigenous struggles today? Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you all for such an interesting panel. I was wondering, well, I have been wondering this for a long time, as Rachel said, if you all can reflect on the institutional design variation, and especially looking at how that matters or not for making visible all the structural violence and legacies of colonialism. Because I think, of course, like in the Colombian case, which is a very particular institutional design, but also it has a particular collaboration with the HEP that makes also a difference for judicialization, you know? And also the Mexican case, like the new report of Ayotzinapa, which is very, very particular, a very less institutionalized process. And then like you look at the report, everything goes directly to the judicial process, to the judicial investigation. They actually gave the material and reconstructed the history based on some of the evidence that the state already had. But when you skim the report, you can't see even one mention to the indigenous population, even when most of the students were indigenous peoples, right? So like you have different outcomes and maybe institutional design and methodologies. That's the other feature in the Colombian case that might seem important, are relevant to think about those outcomes. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much to everyone for, I hope, leading such a much needed discussion on this, on the topic, and following up on Tatiana's question on a recently published investigation in Mexico. A broad question to all panelists would be, and Rachel's mentioned the importance of publicizing, right, all of these events and really shedding light on what happened. But in your views, both when the results of these investigations have been published and in ongoing investigations, what has been indeed the role of public opinion and the public's perception? And this is also, of course, highly dependent on how the media have portrayed, the results of these inquiries, and of course, how politicians may, use them for their own purposes. So what, in your view, in a very broad manner, of course, has been the role of this, the public reaction towards these inquiries? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much all for your presentation, and I have a few questions. My first question is on the importance of Truth Commission as in general, be it for indigenous community or post-conflict on transitional democracy. One of a Truth Commission that is raised as successful Truth Commission in Africa is the South African Truth Commission, which was established after apartheid. Some criticize that it promoted impunity. It left big criminal perpetrators unpunished. In the case of indigenous communities still, don't you think Truth Commission give cover for perpetrators of crime? How do you justify the importance of Truth Commission in liberal democracy from the very beginning? What's your response for these critics? My second question is regarding indigenous community. What material benefit in the indigenous community can get from Truth Commission? After Truth Commission, we have indigenous community in Ethiopia. I agree that indigenous people are the victims of state projects, different projects, investment project, maybe even peacekeeping. Recently in our country, you may have information, Karayu indigenous community has lost all their leaders by the government security force. They have Gada leadership, and they lost all the Gada leaders, and they don't have voice like the elite other community. I agree. The indigenous community are the victims of a state project, but what material benefit will they get from the Truth Commission? The other is in Norway, the Sami community, in Canada, in Canada, also Indigenous community in Australia, Aboriginal community, commissions are established. Now, is a commission established by their own initiation, or who initiated the idea of the establishment of the commission? Are they part of initiating the project, or is that the state or NGO who initiated the idea of establishment of Truth Commission? Thank you so much.
I would like to ask you to ask as quickly as possible, because I really want to have enough time for all the panelists to answer on these super important questions.
Yes, so thank you, everyone. This is really a question about issues of white backlash and issues of how a public acknowledgement of both historical injustice and violence and current impact of such legacies, how that can be integrated into curricula in the US now. Anything to do with Black, Indigenous, people of color is immediately used politically to say there are efforts to make white children feel horrible about themselves. So this is a huge right-wing movement that's impacting teacher education, it's impacting what can be taught, it's impacting what books are banned and what books are not banned. So the question is about how to address white backlash and how educational shifts can rather than be lessened through this process, actually increased, and a more accurate picture of the past can be given so that the future can be changed.
Thank you for your insights. My interest is in the Norwegian case, but the question is prompted by my relative familiarity with dynamics in Canada. And it was mentioned that issues related to the Sami are seen as having to be dealt with internally. And we have a sort of a similar dimension seen in Canada that, Indigenous people have to deal with their own issues. But there's also another dimension that Indigenous or scholars of Indigenous politics in Canada have criticized, and it's referred to as sort of historical temporalization, sort of of ongoing colonial injustice, right? It's not only an issue that Indigenous individuals and communities have to deal with, but it's also an issue in the past that they simply have to get over. And these discussions often are framed within discussions of settler colonialism and in sort of ongoing dispossession and suffering of Indigenous communities. And I'm wondering how and whether these kind of temporal considerations are present within the Norwegian case, and if it's not within the context of settler colonialism, then in what kind of frameworks do those kind of dynamics manifest?
Hi, thanks for your presentations. Just two quick questions. First of all, if you have any hypothesis on why these truth commissions have been spreading everywhere in so many cases around the world. And secondly, to what extent are the truth commissions created because of demands of victims, and to what extent it's the answer that's given by institutions? And if this is the case, then what tensions can be found between victims' expectations in their claims for justice and state answers through truth commissions?
Yeah, thank you for all the questions, and please just, as always, answer on all the questions you.
Okay, thanks for a bunch of...
I was just informed we really need to end in time, so please, as brief as possible.
How can you do justice to 10 big questions in 1 minute? You can't. But who initiated the Truth Commission in Norway? That came from a woman jurist, Sami politician from a minority party who proposed it to the Sami parliament. The Sami parliament wasn't very keen. Eventually, there was a proposal from the Sami parliament to the Norwegian parliament. The Norwegian parliament reacted negatively. Then the question was picked up by 2 left-wing politicians from the north. They pushed through a proposal which eventually was squeezed through parliament. This is all to say that there was a big division both within the Sami community whether a truth commission was necessary or not, And there was a big division in the political elites in Norway whether a truth commission should be set up. So I think we're going to see the implications of this in the report and its aftermath. Just very, very briefly on that. This is what I can do. Okay, thank you. But there were lots of good questions that I think we need to both answer properly and think about.
I'll try and be really quick. And I'm thinking about what we heard about Kashmir this morning. I mean, Indigenous peoples are always already in a state of emergency everywhere. Right? It is not that it closes with a Truth Commission. It's about development priorities and what happens to Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination and territories. So that, do you have white backlash? Yes, of course you have white backlash. How do you tackle that is a conversation we can't have here. And can you stop it? No. But more discussion we need to have about that. Tatiana, does it matter institutional design variation? Yes, very, very much. I mean, yet another Truth Commission report on the disappearance of the 43 Indigenous students in Ayotzinapa that doesn't reference structural violence. How many Truth Commissions can you have on Ayotzinapa with no mention of this? So yes, that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, thank you so much. 10 seconds each, maybe, but then we're really out of time.
Yeah, really quickly. Was the Canadian Truth Commission a success or not? By the measurement of some of the questions, for example, did it make material improvements in the lives of Indigenous people? Did it help them in their battle against extractivism, etc.? The answer to that would largely be no. But well, not yet maybe, but on some level, I think there was surprising outcomes for the Canadian TRC in the form of what I've come to think of as sort of normative transition. So there definitely was a degree to which there was a coming out of survivors of a residential school, to a large extent changing the perspective from having been guilty about the things that had happened to them to having been victims. There was a greater recognition of how widespread the victimization was. And there was also sort of a speaking directly to the Canadian public to implicate not just the government, but everyday Canadians in the duty of coming up with some kind of improvement to the situation.
Okay, just if you want to close 1 second only now, because yes. Okay, so then thank you so much. Or yes, you.
No, I just wanted to say I don't want to say anything.
Okay.
The time has come.
Okay, so then thank you so much, and yes, I hope we continue all this discussion then in the breaks.